Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, where we explore the fascinating yet mundane details of the past to help you drift off peacefully. Tonight, we're stepping into the aromatic world of Tudor England, where personal hygiene was, well, let's just say it was quite different from today's standards. Picture this. It's 1550, and you're walking through the cobblestone streets of London. The first thing that would hit you wouldn't be the sights or sounds, but the overwhelming assault on your nostrils. The smell of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and human waste would be so intense that wealthy visitors often carried pomanders filled with herbs just to breathe. But before we dive into the grimy details of Tudor bathing habits, or lack thereof, let me paint you a picture of what's coming. We'll discover why Queen Elizabeth I allegedly bathed only once a month, whether she needed it or not. We'll explore the fascinating world of Tudor toiletries, where urine was considered a premium teeth whitener, and where the wealthy rubbed themselves with expensive linens instead of washing with water. Tonight's journey will take us through the daily routines of both peasants and nobility, revealing how social status determined not just what you wore, but how often you cleaned it. We'll uncover the surprising reasons why bathing was actually considered dangerous to your health, and why medieval medical advice suggested that water could literally kill you. So settle in, get comfortable, and prepare to learn about an era where being clean was suspicious, where changing your shirt was considered sufficient hygiene, and where the phrase cleanliness is next to godliness definitely hadn't been invented yet. Let's begin our malodorous journey through Tudor England, where even the royalty had a rather distinctive aroma. The Tudor period, spanning from 1485 to 1603, represents one of the most fascinating yet hygienically challenging eras in English history. When we think of Henry VII's court or Elizabeth I's golden age, we often picture grand palaces and elaborate clothing. But the reality of daily cleanliness tells a very different story. To understand Tudor hygiene, we must first abandon our modern assumptions about cleanliness. The concept of daily bathing was not only uncommon, but actively discouraged by medical professionals of the time. Tudor physicians believed that water could weaken the body and make it vulnerable to disease. They thought that bathing opened the pores, allowing harmful vapors and illnesses to enter the body. This medical theory, known as miasma theory, dominated Tudor thinking about health and cleanliness. Doctors believed that bad air, or miasma, carried diseases, and that bathing made people more susceptible to these airborne illnesses. As a result, most Tudors went months, or even years, without a proper bath. Instead of water-based cleaning, Tudors relied heavily on what they called dry cleaning. This involved changing their undergarments regularly, particularly their linen shirts and chemises. These undergarments were made of linen because it was believed to absorb the body's impurities and odors. The wealthy would change their linen daily, while the poor might change theirs weekly, or even less frequently. The process of laundering these garments was labor-intensive and time-consuming. Clothes were washed in large vats using lye soap made from animal fat and ash. The washing process could take an entire day, involving soaking, boiling, scrubbing, and rinsing. This made frequent washing impractical for most households. Perfumes and herbs played a crucial role in Tudor hygiene practices. The wealthy would carry pomanders, small perforated balls filled with aromatic herbs and spices to mask body odors. These pomanders were often made of silver or gold and worn as jewelry. Common herbs used included lavender, rosemary, and thyme, which were believed to have purifying properties. Hair care in Tudor times was equally problematic by modern standards. Most people washed their hair infrequently, perhaps once a month or less. Instead, they used dry cleaning methods, brushing their hair vigorously to remove dirt and debris. The wealthy would use combs made of ivory or silver, while the poor made do with wooden combs. Lice and other parasites were constant companions for most Tudors. Even the nobility struggled with these unwanted guests. Special combs were designed specifically for removing lice, and various herbal treatments were employed to combat infestations. Some people would even shave their heads completely and wear wigs to avoid lice problems. Dental hygiene was perhaps the most neglected aspect of Tudor cleanliness. Toothbrushes didn't exist, and most people cleaned their teeth with rough cloths or their fingers. The wealthy might use toothpicks made of silver or gold, but these were more for removing food particles than actual cleaning. Tooth powder made from ground shells, salt, or herbs was sometimes used, but it was often too abrasive and damaged the teeth. The Tudor diet, rich in sugar for the wealthy, contributed significantly to dental problems. Sugar was a luxury item, and consuming it was a sign of wealth and status. However, this led to severe tooth decay and loss among the upper classes. Queen Elizabeth I herself was known to have blackened teeth from sugar consumption. Makeup and cosmetics served a dual purpose in Tudor times, both for beauty and hygiene. White lead-based face paints were popular among the wealthy, as pale skin was considered fashionable. These cosmetics were extremely toxic, but were believed to protect the skin from harmful air. Rouge made from mercury was used to add color to cheeks and lips, despite its poisonous properties. The clothing of the Tudor period was designed partly to address hygiene concerns. Multiple layers of clothing helped absorb body odors and protect the outer garments from direct contact with the skin. The wealthy would wear elaborate ruffs around their necks, which served both as fashion statements and practical barriers against body odor. Fabrics played an important role in Tudor hygiene practices. Wool was preferred for outer garments because it naturally repelled odors. and could be worn for extended periods without washing. Silk was reserved for the very wealthy and was considered the most hygienic fabric because of its smooth texture and natural properties. Public bathhouses, which had been common in medieval times, were largely closed during the Tudor period due to concerns about disease transmission and moral corruption. The few remaining bathhouses were often associated with prostitution and were avoided by respectable society. This left most people without access to proper bathing facilities. The homes of even wealthy Tudors lacked what we would consider basic sanitary facilities. Chamber pots were used for waste disposal, and these were often emptied out of windows into the streets below. The phrase garde-à-l'eau, derived from the French garde, l'eau meaning watch out for the water, was shouted as a warning before emptying chamber pots. Servants played a crucial role in maintaining what hygiene standards existed. Wealthy households employed specialized servants for different aspects of cleanliness, including laundresses for washing clothes, barbers for hair care, and even grooms of the stool for attending to bodily functions. These servants were essential for maintaining the appearance of cleanliness among the upper classes. The concept of privacy around bodily functions was very different in Tudor times. It was common for people to relieve themselves in public, and chamber pots were used openly in social settings. Even in royal courts, bodily functions were handled with little regard for what we would consider proper privacy. Regional differences in hygiene practices existed throughout Tudor England. Rural areas often had better access to fresh water and could maintain slightly better hygiene standards than crowded urban areas. However, even in the countryside, bathing was infrequent, and many of the same misconceptions about water and health prevailed. The end of the Tudor period saw some gradual changes in attitudes toward hygiene, but these changes were slow and limited to the upper classes. The influence of continental European practices began to introduce new concepts of cleanliness, but it would be many more decades before significant improvements in hygiene became widespread throughout English society. Understanding Tudor hygiene practices helps us appreciate how dramatically our concepts of cleanliness have evolved over the centuries, and sets the stage for exploring the specific challenges and solutions that defined daily life in this remarkable period of English history. Now, let's wade into the murky waters of Tudor bathing practices, where cleanliness was not next to godliness, but rather next to impossible. The relationship between Tudors and water was complicated, to say the least, filled with superstitions, medical theories, and practical challenges that would make modern hygienists weep into their antibacterial soap. The Tudor attitude toward bathing was shaped by a perfect storm of medieval medical theory and religious doctrine. Physicians of the time believed that water could open the pores of the skin, making the body vulnerable to disease and evil humors. This wasn't just casual advice. It was considered serious medical wisdom, passed down through generations of learned men who had never heard of bacteria, but were absolutely certain that water was dangerous. According to Tudor medical texts, bathing could cause the body to become weak and susceptible to illness. The skin, they believed, was a protective barrier that shouldn't be compromised by excessive moisture. Hot water was considered particularly dangerous, as it could cause the blood to rush to the surface, creating an imbalance in the body's natural humors. Cold water wasn't much better, as it could shock the system and cause various ailments. Religious authorities added their own concerns to the mix. The Catholic Church had long associated public bathing with moral corruption, pointing to the Roman bathhouses as examples of decadence and sin. When the Protestant Reformation swept through England, these attitudes didn't disappear. They simply found new justifications. Cleanliness of the soul was far more important than cleanliness of the body, and spending too much time on physical appearance was considered vanity. But let's be practical about this. Even if Tudors had wanted to bathe regularly, the logistics would have been nightmarish. Imagine the process. Water had to be drawn from wells or rivers, heated over open fires, and transported to wherever the bathing would take place. For most people, this meant filling a wooden tub in front of the kitchen fire, assuming they even owned such a luxury as a bathtub. The wealthy had slightly better options, but even their bathing arrangements were elaborate affairs. A full bath required servants to heat and carry dozens of buckets of water, often up multiple flights of stairs. The water would cool quickly in drafty Tudor homes, making the experience more ordeal than pleasure. Most noble households owned only one or two bathtubs, which meant that when bathing did occur, it was often a family affair, with multiple people sharing the same water. This sharing of bathwater followed a strict hierarchy that reveals much about Tudor society. The lord of the house would bathe first in the cleanest, hottest water. Next came his wife, then their children in order of age and importance, followed by servants, and finally, if there was any water left, the family dog. By the time the last person climbed into the tub, the water would be lukewarm, gray, and filled with the accumulated grime of everyone who had gone before. The phrase, "don't throw the baby out with the bathwater," actually originates from this period, when the water would be so murky by the end of the bathing session that a small child might literally be overlooked and accidentally discarded with the dirty water. This wasn't just a colorful saying. It was a genuine concern in households where bathing water was precious and reused extensively. For most Tudors, a full bath was a rare event, reserved for special occasions like weddings, religious festivals, or serious illness. Some people might go months or even years between proper baths. Instead, they relied on what was called dry cleaning, using linen cloths to wipe away surface dirt and sweat. This practice was actually recommended by physicians, who believed that rubbing the skin with clean, dry cloth was healthier than immersing the body in water. The wealthy developed elaborate rituals around their infrequent baths. Bathing became a social event, with friends and courtiers invited to witness the process. The bather would be attended by servants who would scrub, rinse, and dry them with great ceremony. Herbs and flowers were often added to the water, not primarily for fragrance, but because they were believed to have medicinal properties that could counteract the dangerous effects of bathing. Rosewater was particularly popular among the nobility, as roses were thought to strengthen the heart and improve the complexion. Lavender was used for its supposed calming properties, while mint was believed to sharpen the mind. These herbal baths were expensive luxuries, requiring fresh flowers and herbs that had to be carefully prepared and steeped in the water. The resulting mixture was more like a medicinal tea than what we would recognize as bathwater. Public bathhouses, which had been common in medieval times, largely disappeared during the Tudor period. Those that remained were viewed with deep suspicion by both religious and secular authorities. They were associated with prostitution, disease, and moral corruption. Concerns that weren't entirely unfounded, as these establishments often served multiple purposes beyond simple bathing. The few public baths that operated in Tudor England were heavily regulated and frequently raided by local authorities. They were required to separate men and women, maintain certain standards of cleanliness, and close during religious holidays. Many cities simply banned them outright, viewing them as threats to public morality and health. Rivers and streams provided the most accessible bathing option for common people, but even this came with risks and restrictions. Many communities had laws governing when and where people could bathe in public waters, often restricting the practice to early morning hours or designated areas downstream from drinking water sources. Swimming and bathing in rivers was also seasonal. Few people were brave enough to venture into English waters during the colder months. The wealthy sometimes had private access to natural springs or constructed elaborate bathing pools on their estates. These were considered great luxuries and were often designed more for show than for regular use. Henry VIII, despite his legendary appetite for luxury, was known to bathe infrequently, preferring to rely on fresh linens and perfumes to maintain his royal presence. As we drift toward our next topic, consider the irony that an age obsessed with appearance and social status was simultaneously convinced that one of the most basic forms of personal care was dangerous and immoral. The Tudor approach to bathing created a society where people spent enormous effort on their clothing and accessories while neglecting the body underneath, leading to a peculiar form of surface-level sophistication built on a foundation of fundamental uncleanliness. Now, if you thought Tudor body odor was unpleasant, wait until we explore what was happening inside their mouths. Dental hygiene in Tudor England was a fascinating blend of genuine attempts at care and practices that would horrify modern dentists. The state of Tudor teeth tells us a remarkable story about social class, available resources, and the curious relationship between wealth and health. Let's start with the basics of Tudor tooth care. Most ordinary people cleaned their teeth using a simple piece of rough cloth, often linen, which they would rub vigorously against their teeth and gums. This cloth was sometimes dipped in salt, which actually wasn't a terrible idea from a modern perspective, as salt has natural antibacterial properties. However, the vigorous rubbing often did more harm than good, wearing away precious enamel and irritating the gums until they bled regularly. The wealthy had access to more sophisticated tools. Toothpicks made from precious metals like silver or gold were status symbols, often ornately decorated and worn as jewelry when not in use. These picks were used to remove food particles wedged between teeth, though the technique was often aggressive enough to damage the gums. Some nobles owned primitive toothbrushes made from twigs, particularly from aromatic woods like rosemary or mint-scented herbs, which were chewed at one end until the fibers separated into bristles. Tudor tooth powder was a curious concoction that varied wildly depending on one's social standing and regional availability. Common ingredients included ground cuttlefish bone, which provided a mildly abrasive texture for scrubbing away plaque. Crushed eggshells served a similar purpose, though they were often too harsh and actually scratched the tooth enamel. More exotic powders included ground pearls for the extremely wealthy, crushed coral for the moderately prosperous, and simple ash from burned bread for the poor. Herbs played a significant role in Tudor dental care. Sage was burned, and the smoke inhaled, believed to strengthen teeth and freshen breath. Rosemary was chewed fresh or dried, leaving a pleasant taste and providing some antibacterial benefits. Mint, when available, was treasured for its breath-freshening properties. However, many herbs used for dental care were chosen more for their supposed magical properties than any real medicinal benefit. The Tudor diet had a devastating impact on dental health, particularly among the wealthy. Sugar, newly imported from the Caribbean, became a luxury item that the rich consumed in alarming quantities. Elaborate sugar sculptures adorned noble tables, and sweet preserves, candied fruits, and sugar-dusted pastries became symbols of wealth and sophistication. This sugar consumption led to rampant tooth decay among the upper classes, creating the paradox where the wealthy often had worse teeth than the poor. Queen Elizabeth I herself became famous for her blackened, rotting teeth, which she attempted to hide behind closed-lip smiles and strategic positioning during portraits. Foreign ambassadors wrote detailed accounts of her dental decay, describing how her teeth had turned black, and many had fallen out entirely. She stuffed her cheeks with cloth during public appearances to maintain the appearance of a full face, a practice that became somewhat fashionable among courtiers who wanted to emulate their queen. Tooth pain was a constant companion for many Tudors, and their remedies ranged from the sensible to the utterly bizarre. Cloves were commonly used to numb toothache, and this practice actually had real merit, as cloves contain eugenol, a natural anesthetic still used in modern dentistry. However, other remedies included placing a dead mouse against the affected tooth, wearing a necklace made from children's teeth, or reciting specific prayers while touching the painful area. When teeth became too damaged or painful to endure, extraction was the only option. Tudor tooth extraction was performed by barbers, blacksmiths, or traveling tooth pullers who set up at markets and fairs. These practitioners used crude iron pliers, often rusty and certainly not sterilized. The patient would be held down by several strong men while the tooth was yanked out, usually breaking into pieces and leaving infected fragments in the gum. The aftermath of tooth extraction was often worse than the original problem. Without any understanding of infection control, the open wounds in the mouth frequently became severely infected. Patients developed abscesses, blood poisoning, and sometimes died from complications that modern medicine could easily prevent. Those who survived often lost multiple teeth in a cascading series of infections and extractions. Replacement teeth were available for the wealthy, though they were hardly an improvement over having no teeth at all. Dentures were carved from ivory, ox bone, or even wood, and held in place with silk threads or gold wire. These primitive prosthetics were uncomfortable, made eating difficult, and often fell out at inconvenient moments. Some nobles had teeth pulled from executed criminals, or desperate poor people transplanted into their own mouths, though these rarely took root and usually fell out within weeks. The social implications of poor dental health were significant in Tudor society. Bad breath was considered a sign of moral corruption or disease, leading people to chew aromatic herbs constantly or hold perfumed handkerchiefs near their faces during conversations. Missing teeth affected speech, making it difficult for people to communicate clearly, which could impact their social standing and professional opportunities. Regional variations in dental care reflected local resources and traditions. In coastal areas, people used ground seashells as tooth powder and chewed seaweed for its mineral content. In forested regions, various tree barks were used for their astringent properties. Urban areas had access to imported spices and exotic remedies, while rural communities relied on whatever herbs grew locally. Children's dental care was largely neglected, based on the belief that baby teeth were unimportant since they would fall out anyway. This led to early childhood tooth decay that often spread to permanent teeth as they emerged. Many Tudor children suffered from chronic dental pain that affected their nutrition, growth, and overall health throughout their lives. The connection between dental health and overall health was poorly understood in Tudor times. They didn't realize that infected teeth could lead to heart problems, kidney disease, or other serious conditions. Many mysterious illnesses and deaths that plagued Tudor England were likely caused or complicated by severe dental infections that spread throughout the body. As we drift deeper into this exploration of Tudor dental practices, imagine the constant discomfort that shaped daily life for so many people. The persistent ache of decaying teeth, the embarrassment of blackened stumps, the fear of the tooth puller's pliers. These were the realities that our ancestors endured, making their resilience all the more remarkable as we settle into our comfortable modern world, grateful for fluoride and dental floss. Now we venture into perhaps the most unpleasant aspect of Tudor hygiene waste disposal. In an era without modern plumbing or sewage systems, dealing with human waste was a constant, malodorous challenge that affected every level of society. The wealthy had their guardrobes, essentially toilets built into castle and manor house walls. These were small chambers with wooden seats positioned over chutes that dropped waste directly outside the building. The word guardrobe literally meant guard the robe, as these spaces were also used to store clothing, believing the ammonia from urine would repel moths and fleas. Guardrobes were typically built on upper floors, allowing gravity to carry waste down through stone chutes to collection points below. Some emptied into moats, creating a particularly foul defensive barrier. Others deposited waste into pits that required regular cleaning by unfortunate servants known as gong farmers. The positioning of guardrobes was crucial. They were often built into exterior walls with chutes angled outward, ensuring waste fell away from the building's foundation. Some castles had multiple guardrobes sharing a single chute, creating a vertical waste highway that required careful timing to avoid unpleasant encounters. Privacy was minimal in these facilities. Many guardrobes were communal, with multiple seats side by side. Conversation during use was considered normal, turning waste disposal into an oddly social activity. The wealthy might have curtains for modest privacy, but complete isolation was rare. For those who couldn't afford guardrobes, chamber pots were the standard solution. These ceramic or metal vessels were kept in bedrooms and used throughout the night. Come morning, the contents needed disposal, usually by throwing them directly out windows into the streets below. The phrase gardaloo became a common warning cry in Tudor cities, derived from the French garde à l'eau, meaning watch out for the water. This shout was supposed to alert pedestrians before chamber pot contents came cascading down from upper story windows, though the warning was often ignored or came too late. Street cleaning was virtually non-existent in most Tudor towns. Human waste mixed with animal droppings, food scraps, and general refuse to create a putrid soup that filled gutters and accumulated in corners. Rain provided the only regular cleaning, washing this mixture toward rivers and streams. The Thames in London became an open sewer, receiving waste from thousands of chamber pots, guardrobes, and public latrines. The river's tidal action helped carry some waste out to sea, but much remained, creating a perpetual stench that hung over the city like a malodorous fog. Public latrines, called houses of easement, were built over rivers and streams when possible. These communal facilities consisted of wooden planks with holes, positioned over flowing water that theoretically carried waste away. However, these structures were often poorly maintained and became breeding grounds for disease. The famous London Bridge had public latrines built directly over the Thames. Users sat suspended over the river, their waste dropping directly into the water below. These facilities were considered conveniences for travelers and merchants, though the experience was far from pleasant. Rural areas had different waste disposal methods. Farmers used human waste as fertilizer, collecting it in pits before spreading it on fields. This practice, while practical, created health hazards as parasites and diseases spread through contaminated crops and water sources. Monasteries and wealthy estates sometimes employed more sophisticated systems. Some had running water channeled through stone conduits to carry waste away from living areas. These early sewage systems were marvels of engineering, but remained rare due to their complexity and cost. The gong farmers we mentioned earlier were essential workers in Tudor waste management. They cleaned out castle guardrobes, emptied public latrines, and maintained private waste pits. This was dangerous, dirty work. Many gong farmers died from toxic fumes or drowning in waste pits. These workers operated primarily at night, earning them the nickname Nightsel men. They used long-handled tools to extract waste, loading it onto carts for transport to fields outside town walls. The smell was so overwhelming that gong farmers were often required to live in designated areas, separated from the general population. Waste disposal created serious health hazards throughout Tudor England. Contaminated water supplies led to cholera, dysentery, and typhoid outbreaks. The connection between waste and disease wasn't understood, so these epidemics were often attributed to bad air or divine punishment. Wells and water sources were frequently contaminated by nearby waste pits and latrines. Families unknowingly drank water tainted with human waste, perpetuating cycles of illness and death. The wealthy could afford to have water brought from distant, cleaner sources, but the poor had no such luxury. Some Tudor innovations attempted to address waste problems. Wealthy households employed close stools, portable toilets with built-in waste containers that could be easily emptied These ornate pieces of furniture were often beautifully crafted, disguising their unseemly purpose behind velvet cushions and decorative woodwork. The royal court had its own waste disposal challenges. Even palaces struggled with sanitation, despite having the best available facilities. Hampton Court Palace, for instance, had an elaborate system of guardrobes and waste chutes, but the sheer number of courtiers overwhelmed these systems during major gatherings. Henry VII's court was notorious for its waste problems. With hundreds of courtiers, servants, and visitors, even the most sophisticated palace facilities couldn't cope. The court frequently moved between residences, partly to allow thorough cleaning of waste-contaminated areas. Women faced particular challenges with waste disposal. Their clothing made using guardrobes and chamber pots difficult and time-consuming. Long skirts and multiple layers meant that even basic bodily functions became complicated affairs, requiring assistance or careful maneuvering. Children learned waste disposal practices early, though infant care created additional challenges. Cloth diapers were rare and expensive. So many bobbies simply went without, creating constant cleaning demands for mothers and nurses. Wealthier families might use soft fabrics, but most made do with whatever materials were available. The psychological impact of living surrounded by waste cannot be understated. Tudor people developed remarkable tolerance for smells and sights that would horrify modern sensibilities. This acceptance was born of necessity. There were simply no alternatives available to most of the population. As we drift deeper into sleep, imagine the constant background odor that permeated Tudor life. The mixture of human waste, rotting food, and unwashed bodies created an olfactory landscape that defined daily existence. Tomorrow, we'll explore how Tudor people attempted to mask these overwhelming smells with perfumes and herbs in their endless battle against the aromatic assault of their unwashed world. Now let's turn our attention to Tudor clothing and how people kept their garments clean, or rather, how they attempted to. The relationship between Tudor society and clothing cleanliness reveals fascinating insights into daily life, social status, and practical challenges of the era. The wealthy Tudor elite owned multiple sets of clothing, which allowed them to rotate garments while others were being cleaned. A typical nobleman might possess dozens of shirts, doublets, and hose, stored in large wooden chests with herbs like lavender and rosemary to ward off moths and provide pleasant scents. These aromatic herbs served dual purposes, acting as natural pest deterrents while masking any lingering odors from previous wear. However, the cleaning process itself was labor-intensive and time-consuming. Washing clothing required heating large quantities of water over open fires, a task that consumed considerable fuel and time. Servants would spend entire days devoted to laundry, scrubbing garments by hand using harsh lye soap made from wood ash and animal fat. This caustic soap was effective at removing dirt and grease, but could be brutal on both fabrics and skin. The wealthy had another advantage in their approach to clothing cleanliness through the use of linen undergarments. These served as protective barriers between the body and expensive outer clothing made from silk, velvet, or fine wool. The linen could be washed more frequently and easily than the elaborate outer garments, which might require professional cleaning or careful spot treatment to avoid damage. Linen shirts and chemises were considered the foundation of cleanliness in Tudor fashion. These undergarments absorbed sweat and oils from the body, protecting the more valuable outer layers. A clean linen shirt was often seen as more important than a clean outer doublet, and changing one's linen regularly was a mark of good breeding and proper hygiene habits. For the working classes, clothing cleanliness presented entirely different challenges. Most laborers owned only 1 or 2 sets of clothing, making regular washing impractical. They couldn't afford to be without their garments while they dried, especially during cold months when drying could take days. Instead, they relied on brushing, beating, and airing out their clothes to remove surface dirt and odors. The materials available to common people also affected cleanliness practices. Wool, the most common fabric for everyday clothing, was naturally resistant to odors and could go longer between cleanings than other materials. However, wool was also prone to shrinking and felting when washed improperly, making people cautious about frequent washing. Professional laundresses played crucial roles in Tudor society, especially in urban areas. These skilled workers understood the properties of different fabrics and the best methods for cleaning various types of stains. They used an arsenal of techniques, from soaking garments in urine for its ammonia content, to using fullers, earth clay, for removing grease stains from wool. The process of washing clothes often began with sorting garments by color and fabric type. White linens were typically boiled in large cauldrons with lye soap, and sometimes bleached using sulfur fumes or exposure to sunlight. Colored fabrics required gentler treatment to prevent fatting, often being washed in cooler water with milder soaps made from soapwood plants. Starch became increasingly important in Tudor clothing care, particularly for ruffs and collars that needed to maintain their shape. Laundresses would prepare starch from wheat flour or rice, creating solutions of varying strengths depending on the stiffness required. The application of starch was an art form, requiring skill to achieve the desired effect without creating a stiff, uncomfortable garment. Drying clothes presented its own set of challenges, especially during England's frequently damp weather. Indoor drying was common, with garments hung near fireplaces or in special drying rooms when available. Outdoor drying required careful timing to avoid rain, and clothes were often bushes or grass rather than hung on lines, which weren't widely used until later periods. The concept of seasonal clothing storage also influenced cleanliness practices. Heavy winter garments would be carefully cleaned and stored with herbs and spices during summer months. This storage process often included beating the garments to remove dust and insects, then packing them in chests with aromatic substances like cloves, cinnamon, or dried flowers. Spot cleaning was an essential skill for maintaining clothing between full washings. Tudor people became adept at treating specific stains with targeted remedies. Wine stains might be treated with salt or white wine, while grease stains could be addressed with fuller's earth or even bread crumbs used as absorbents. The social implications of clothing cleanliness extended beyond personal comfort to public perception and professional success. Merchants, craftsmen, and anyone conducting business understood that clean, well-maintained clothing projected competence and trustworthiness. Even those with limited resources would prioritize keeping their best garments clean for important occasions. Religious and moral dimensions also influenced attitudes toward clothing cleanliness. The Protestant Reformation brought increased emphasis on cleanliness as a reflection of spiritual purity. Clean clothing became associated with moral virtue, while dirty or unkempt appearance might suggest moral failings or lack of self-discipline. Seasonal variations significantly affected clothing cleaning practices. Summer months offered better drying conditions and made the labor of heating water less burdensome. Winter washing was often limited to essential undergarments, with outer clothing receiving more attention through brushing and airing rather than full washing. The Tudor period also saw innovations in clothing design that supported cleanliness efforts. Detachable collars and cuffs became popular because these high-wear areas could be removed and washed separately from the main garment. This practical innovation allowed people to maintain a clean appearance without washing entire garments as frequently. Regional differences in water quality affected clothing cleaning practices across Tudor England. Areas with soft water found soap more effective and required less of it, while regions with hard water struggled with soap scum and less effective cleaning. Some areas became known for particularly good laundry conditions, attracting professional laundresses and establishing reputations for superior cleaning services. As we can see, clothing cleanliness in Tudor England was far more complex than simply throwing garments in a washing machine. It required planning, skill, resources, and considerable time investment, making it both a practical necessity and a marker of social status in this fascinating period of English history. The pursuit of beauty in Tudor England was a dangerous game, where cosmetics could literally kill you. While we worry about chemical ingredients today, Tudor women painted their faces with lead, mercury, and arsenic, all in the name of fashion. The ideal Tudor complexion was ghostly pale, smooth as marble, and utterly artificial. White lead formed the foundation of Tudor makeup, mixed with vinegar to create a paste called ceruse. Women slathered this toxic concoction across their faces, necks, and exposed skin, creating an otherworldly pallor that was considered the height of sophistication. The whiter the skin, the more aristocratic you appeared, as it suggested you never labored outdoors under the sun. Queen Elizabeth herself was famous for her dramatic white face paint, which she applied in increasingly thick layers as she aged. Contemporary accounts describe her makeup as so heavy it cracked when she smiled, revealing the ravaged skin beneath. The lead slowly poisoned her system, causing hair loss, tooth decay, and eventual organ failure. But she continued the practice until her death. The process of applying ceruse was elaborate and time-consuming. Ladies would begin by washing their faces with a mixture of wine and breadcrumbs, then apply a base layer of pig fat or sheep's wool grease. The white lead paste came next, smoothed on with brushes made from animal hair, building up multiple coats until the desired opacity was achieved. Red cheeks and lips provided contrast to the white canvas, but these cosmetics carried their own dangers. Vermilion, made from ground cinnabar containing mercury sulfide, gave a brilliant red color that slowly drove users mad. The phrase, "mad as a hatter," actually originated from hat makers who used mercury in their trade. But Tudor ladies were poisoning themselves just as effectively with their rouge. For those who couldn't afford vermilion, alternatives included crushed beetles, red ochre mixed with animal fat, or even fresh blood from recently slaughtered animals. Wealthy women would pinch their cheeks or bite their lips before appearing in public, creating a natural flush that complemented their artificial pallor. Eyebrows presented another challenge entirely. The fashion demanded high, arched brows that were often completely artificial. Women would pluck out their natural eyebrows entirely, then paint new ones higher on their foreheads, using kohl made from burned almonds, lead, or antimony. Some used mouse hair glued to their faces to create the perfect arch. Hair was equally artificial and elaborate. Wealthy Tudor women rarely showed their natural hair, instead wearing complex wigs and hairpieces made from the hair of peasants or even horses. These constructions were built up on wire frames, creating towering edifices that could stand 2 feet high or more. The process of creating these hairstyles took hours and required multiple servants. Hair was first washed with lye soap that often contained caustic ingredients, then set with a mixture of gum arabic and egg whites. False hair was woven in, curled with heated irons, and held in place with pins made from bone or metal. Perfumes and pomanders were essential accessories, not just for pleasant scent, but to mask the odors that accumulated in these elaborate hairstyles. Women would tuck small bags of herbs and spices into their hair constructions, creating a mobile garden of fragrances that followed them wherever they went. Teeth presented perhaps the greatest cosmetic challenge of all. Sugar was a luxury item in Tudor England, but those who could afford it consumed it eagerly, leading to rapid tooth decay. Black, rotting teeth were so common among the wealthy that some people actually blackened healthy teeth to appear fashionable and prosperous. Tooth cleaning was primitive and often counterproductive. People used cloths to rub their teeth with mixtures of honey, salt, ground bones, or even crushed brick. Some recipes called for the ashes of burned rosemary or sage, while others recommended rubbing teeth with a mixture of wine and ground cuttlefish bone. Breath freshening was equally important and equally hazardous. Popular remedies included chewing on cloves, cinnamon bark, or cardamom seeds. Some people would hold small pieces of gold or silver in their mouths, believing the precious metals would purify their breath and prevent tooth decay. The wealthy sometimes replaced missing teeth with ivory, bone, or even teeth pulled from corpses. These replacements were held in place with gold wire and had to be removed for eating. The sight of a noble lady removing her teeth at dinner was apparently common enough that etiquette books of the period included instructions on how to do so discreetly. Nail care was another mark of status and required constant attention. Long nails indicated that you didn't perform manual labor, so wealthy women grew their nails to extreme lengths and painted them with the same white lead used on their faces. Some even attached artificial extensions made from silver or gold. The maintenance of these cosmetic routines was a full-time occupation for wealthy women and their servants. Each morning began with the removal of the previous day's makeup, using cloths soaked in wine or milk, followed by the application of fresh layers. The process could take several hours and required perfect lighting to achieve the desired effect. Men weren't exempt from these beauty standards either. Wealthy Tudor gentlemen used many of the same cosmetics as women, though typically in more subtle applications. They powdered their faces, rouged their cheeks, and even wore perfumed gloves to mask body odors and display their refinement. The cost of maintaining these appearances was staggering. A single pot of good ceruse could cost more than a servant's yearly wages, while the elaborate wigs and hairpieces required constant maintenance and replacement. Many noble families spent more on cosmetics than on food, viewing appearance as an essential investment in their social standing. As we drift toward sleep, imagine the daily ritual of Tudor beauty preparation, the careful application of toxic paints and powders, the construction of towering hairstyles, and the constant maintenance required to present an acceptable face to the world. In their pursuit of beauty, Tudor nobles created a facade as artificial and fragile as their social positions, painted over the reality beneath with layers of dangerous glamour. The relationship between hygiene and disease in Tudor England was poorly understood, yet the consequences were devastatingly real. Without knowledge of germs or bacteria, people developed elaborate theories about illness that often led them further away from cleanliness rather than toward it. The dominant medical theory of the time was the concept of miasma, or bad air. Tudors believed that diseases spread through foul-smelling vapors that rose from rotting matter, stagnant water, and human waste. This theory wasn't entirely wrong, as many diseases did correlate with poor sanitation, but it led to some peculiar preventative measures. To ward off plague and other illnesses, wealthy Tudors carried pomanders, small decorative balls filled with aromatic substances like cloves, cinnamon, and dried herbs. They believed these sweet scents would create a protective barrier against disease-carrying miasma. The poor, unable to afford such luxuries, often carried bunches of herbs or flowers, leading to the nursery rhyme, "Ring around the rosy," which some scholars believe references plague prevention methods. Ironically, this focus on combating bad smells often discouraged actual cleaning. Many believed that removing the natural oils and odors from their bodies would leave them vulnerable to disease. They thought their personal scent created a protective barrier, much like how we might think of our immune system today, but in reverse. The medical establishment reinforced these beliefs through the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Physicians believed that illness resulted from an imbalance of these humors, which could be corrected through bloodletting, purging, and avoiding activities that might disrupt the body's natural state. Bathing, they argued, could dangerously alter this delicate balance. When the sweating sickness struck England repeatedly during the Tudor period, killing thousands, including members of the royal court, the medical response was telling. Rather than promoting cleanliness, physicians recommended keeping patients warm and dry, avoiding fresh air, and maintaining their natural body heat. Windows were sealed shut, and patients were wrapped in heavy blankets, creating perfect conditions for the disease to spread. The plague, which returned to England multiple times during Tudor rule, prompted more extreme measures. Entire households would be sealed shut if one member fell ill, with red crosses painted on doors and guards posted to prevent escape. Inside these plague houses, families lived in increasingly unsanitary conditions, often accelerating the spread of disease rather than containing it. Religious beliefs also shaped disease prevention methods. Many Tudors believed that illness was divine punishment for sin, leading them to focus on spiritual rather than physical cleansing. Pilgrimages to holy sites, prayer, and acts of penance were considered more effective than washing. Some even believed that suffering through illness in an unclean state demonstrated proper humility before God. The wealthy had access to physicians who prescribed elaborate treatments involving exotic ingredients. A typical prescription might include powdered unicorn horn, which was actually narwhal tusk, mixed with various herbs and metals. These expensive remedies gave the rich a sense of protection, while doing nothing to address the underlying causes of disease. Common folk relied on folk remedies and superstitions passed down through generations. They might wear amulets made from particular stones, recite specific prayers, or perform rituals involving herbs and candles. While some of these practices incorporated genuinely beneficial plants with antimicrobial properties, they were used more for their supposed magical qualities than their actual medicinal effects. The Tudor approach to preventing disease in communal spaces was equally misguided. Public gatherings were rarely canceled for health reasons, and when they were, it was often too late to prevent widespread transmission. Markets, churches, and theaters continued operating even during disease outbreaks, with people believing that their personal protective measures would be sufficient. Hospitals and care facilities of the time were often more dangerous than staying home. These institutions, run primarily by religious orders, focused on spiritual care rather than medical treatment. Patients with different ailments were housed together in large, poorly ventilated rooms. The lack of understanding about contagion meant that those seeking help for minor ailments often left with more serious diseases. Food preservation and preparation methods also contributed to disease transmission. Without refrigeration, food spoilage was common, and the signs of dangerous bacteria were not the wealthy could afford fresher ingredients. But even they lacked knowledge about proper food safety. Water sources in Tudor England were frequently contaminated, yet the connection between dirty water and illness was not established. People continued to draw water from wells and rivers that served as dumping grounds for waste. Beer and ale were often safer to drink than water, not because people understood the sanitizing effects of the brewing process, but because they tasted better and were readily available. The irony of Tudor disease prevention was that many of their methods actually increased their risk of illness. By avoiding bathing, living in poorly ventilated spaces, and maintaining close contact with waste and refuse, they created ideal conditions for disease transmission. Their fear of fresh air led them to seal themselves into contaminated environments, while their distrust of water prevented them from washing away the very contaminants that made them sick. Even when confronted with evidence that cleaner communities had lower rates of disease, Tudors often attributed this to factors like moral virtue, divine favor, or superior breeding, rather than hygiene practices. The scientific method was still centuries away from being applied to medical understanding, leaving people to rely on tradition, superstition, and authority figures, who were often just as ignorant as their patients. This disconnect between cause and effect meant that Tudor England remained trapped in cycles of disease and death that could have been significantly reduced through basic sanitation measures. The very practices they believed would protect them often sealed their fate, creating a tragic irony that would persist until the gradual emergence of scientific understanding in later centuries. Now, you might think that being royalty meant having access to the finest hygiene practices of the age. After all, kings and queens had unlimited resources, armies of servants, and the wealth of entire kingdoms at their disposal. Surely, they must have been paragons of cleanliness in an otherwise grimy world. Well, prepare yourself for disappointment, because even the most powerful monarchs of Tudor England were just as committed to avoiding soap and water as their humblest subjects. Let's start with the most famous Tudor of them all, Henry VIII. This larger-than-life king, known for his 6 wives, his break with Rome, and his increasingly massive waistline, had some truly spectacular hygiene habits. Henry owned what was considered an enormous collection of shirts for the time, over 40 of them. This might sound impressive until you realize that he would wear the same shirt for weeks at a time, believing that the longer he wore it, the more it absorbed his natural oils and became perfectly fitted to his body. Henry's approach to bathing was equally fascinating. He owned several elaborate bathing tubs, including one made of wood lined with linen cloth. But here's the thing, he rarely used them for actual bathing. Instead, these tubs were primarily used for what were called medicinal soaks when he was ill. The rest of the time, Henry relied on his army of servants to help him with what passed for daily hygiene. Each morning, servants would bring him fresh linens and help him change his undergarments, which was considered quite sufficient for maintaining cleanliness. The king's teeth were another matter entirely. Like most people of his era, Henry had terrible dental hygiene. By middle age, his teeth were black and rotting, causing him constant pain and giving him breath that could apparently clear a room. Foreign ambassadors wrote detailed accounts of their audiences with the king, often mentioning the overwhelming smell that surrounded him. One Venetian diplomat described approaching Henry's throne as walking into a wall of the most offensive odors imaginable. But Henry's hygiene challenges weren't just personal, they were political. As his health declined and his hygiene deteriorated, it became increasingly difficult for courtiers to spend extended time in his presence. This created a strange dynamic where the most powerful man in England was also someone that people actively tried to avoid being near. Meetings were kept short, and windows were always opened wide when the king was present. Henry's daughter, Elizabeth I, inherited many things from her father, including his rather creative approach to personal cleanliness. Elizabeth was famous for many things: her intelligence, her political acumen, her defeat of the Spanish Armada. But personal hygiene was not among her strengths. She reportedly bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not, which was actually considered quite frequent for royalty of the time. Elizabeth had her own unique hygiene rituals that were considered the height of sophistication. She would have her servants rub her body with fine linens soaked in rosewater and wine. This was thought to cleanse the skin without the dangerous effects of actually submerging oneself in water. The queen also used large quantities of powder made from ground pearls and lead to whiten her face, completely unaware that she was slowly poisoning herself with heavy metals. The queen's teeth were a particular source of concern for her image-conscious court. Like most people of her era, Elizabeth had a serious sweet tooth and access to expensive sugar, which was devastating to her dental health. By her 40s, many of her teeth had turned black or fallen out entirely. This created a significant problem for a monarch who needed to maintain an image of health and vitality. Elizabeth's solution was typically creative. She would stuff her cheeks with cloth to give her face a fuller appearance and speak in a way that minimized showing her teeth. Foreign visitors to Elizabeth's court often commented on the overwhelming smell that permeated the royal presence. The combination of unwashed bodies, heavy perfumes, rotting food and teeth, and various medicinal treatments created what one French ambassador described as an assault upon all the senses simultaneously. Yet this was considered perfectly normal and even sophisticated by the standards of the time. The royal approach to hygiene extended to their living spaces as well. Royal palaces were magnificent to look at, but they were also incredibly unsanitary by modern standards. Rushes on the floors were changed infrequently, allowing food scraps, animal waste, and human refuse to accumulate underneath. The smell in royal chambers was often so overwhelming that courtiers would carry small bouquets of flowers or herbs to hold under their noses during formal occasions. Even the royal kitchens, which prepared food for hundreds of people daily, operated under hygiene standards that would horrify us today. Cooks rarely washed their hands. Meat was often partially spoiled before cooking, and the same utensils were used to prepare multiple dishes without cleaning. Food poisoning was so common at court that it was simply accepted as a normal part of royal life. What's particularly fascinating is how the royal court's hygiene practices influenced the entire kingdom. Because courtiers wanted to emulate their monarchs, the personal habits of kings and queens literally set the standard for what was considered acceptable throughout English society. When Henry avoided bathing, it reinforced the idea that frequent washing was unnecessary or even harmful. When Elizabeth used lead-based cosmetics, it started a trend that spread throughout the upper classes. The irony is that these monarchs had access to resources that could have made them the cleanest people in their kingdom. They had armies of servants, unlimited access to clean water, the finest soaps imported from across Europe, and elaborate bathing facilities. Yet, they chose to embrace the same hygiene practices as their subjects, believing that cleanliness was not only unnecessary, but potentially dangerous to their health and social standing. So the next time you read about the grandeur and sophistication of Tudor royal courts, remember that beneath all that silk and gold were some of the smelliest, dirtiest people in the kingdom. Even unlimited power and wealth couldn't overcome the deeply ingrained cultural beliefs about hygiene that dominated Tudor England. The streets of Tudor cities were a sensory assault that would overwhelm any modern visitor. London, the largest city in England with perhaps 100,000 inhabitants by the late 1600s, was a maze of narrow, winding streets where waste, commerce, and daily life intermingled in ways that defied our contemporary understanding of urban planning. The primary method of waste disposal was startlingly simple and universally practiced. Residents would collect their household refuse, human waste, and kitchen scraps in chamber pots, buckets, or simple containers. When these receptacles became full, the contents were unceremoniously thrown directly into the street below. This practice was so common that it had its own warning cry. Before emptying their waste, residents were supposed to shout "Garde-à-l'eau," a corruption of the French phrase "garde à l'eau," meaning watch out for the water. However, this courteous warning was often ignored or forgotten, especially during nighttime hours when the cover of darkness provided anonymity for those disposing of their waste. The result was that pedestrians learned to walk quickly through city streets, staying close to building walls and avoiding the center of roadways where the majority of waste accumulated. The streets themselves became open sewers, with a central channel called a kennel running down the middle of most roads. These kennels were designed to carry away rainwater, but they quickly became clogged with solid waste, food scraps, dead animals, and other refuse. During dry periods, the waste would accumulate and putrefy, creating a thick, malodorous sludge that attracted flies, rats, and other vermin. When rain finally came, it would wash this accumulated filth through the streets in torrents of brown, foul-smelling water that flowed toward the nearest river or stream. The Thames, London's primary waterway, received the bulk of the city's waste. The river served simultaneously as the city's main source of drinking water, its primary transportation route, and its largest sewer. Professional waste collectors, known as gong farmers or night soil men, operated in larger cities. These hardy individuals would collect human waste from private homes and public latrines, loading it onto carts for transport outside the city walls. The waste was then sold to farmers as fertilizer, creating one of the few profitable aspects of Tudor waste management. However, these services were expensive and primarily available to wealthy households. The majority of urban residents had no choice but to rely on public facilities or improvised solutions. Public latrines, called houses of easement, were built over rivers, streams, or large pits. These structures were often overcrowded, poorly maintained, and structurally unsound. It was not uncommon for public latrines to collapse under the weight of too many users, sending unfortunate individuals tumbling into the waste below. Some entrepreneurial citizens created private latrines that extended over rivers or streams, building wooden structures that jutted out from their homes directly over the water. These contraptions, while providing more privacy than public facilities, contributed significantly to water pollution. The practice became so widespread that laws were eventually passed requiring minimum distances between latrines and water sources, though enforcement was sporadic at best. The disposal of other types of waste presented additional challenges. Butchers would throw animal blood, entrails, and scraps directly into the streets. The smell of rotting meat mixed with human waste created an olfactory nightmare that permeated entire neighborhoods. Tanners, who processed animal hides into leather, used urine and animal dung in their work, adding another layer of stench to urban areas. Dead animals were a constant presence in Tudor streets. Horses, dogs, cats, and livestock that died in the city were often left where they fell, slowly decomposing and adding to the general miasma. Professional dead horse men would eventually collect these carcasses, but the process could take days or weeks, during which time the bodies would bloat, burst, and attract clouds of flies. The wealthy attempted to insulate themselves from these conditions by living in houses set back from the street, employing servants to handle waste disposal, and using private transportation to avoid walking through the filth. However, even the grandest Tudor mansions could not completely escape the pervasive smell and health hazards of urban waste. City authorities made periodic attempts to address sanitation issues, but their efforts were largely ineffective. Laws were passed requiring residents to keep the streets in front of their homes clean, but enforcement was minimal, and fines were often ignored. Some cities employed street cleaners, known as scavengers, but their numbers were insufficient to make a significant impact on the overwhelming amount of waste produced daily. The concept of organized municipal waste collection was still centuries in the future. Instead, Tudor cities relied on a combination of individual responsibility, market forces, and natural processes to manage their waste. Rain would wash away some refuse, animals would consume organic matter, and time would eventually decompose the rest. But the cycle never truly ended. Public health officials of the time did recognize some connection between filth and disease, but their understanding was limited by prevailing medical theories. The miasma theory suggested that disease was caused by bad air or foul odors, leading to attempts to combat illness through the use of strong perfumes and aromatic herbs, rather than addressing the underlying sanitation problems. This primitive understanding of hygiene and disease transmission meant that efforts to improve urban sanitation were often misdirected. Instead of focusing on waste removal and water purification, Authorities might mandate the burning of aromatic woods in public spaces or require citizens to carry pomanders filled with spices and herbs. The result was an urban environment that was not only unpleasant, but genuinely dangerous to human health. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and plague thrived in these conditions, spreading rapidly through crowded neighborhoods where waste and drinking water sources were often contaminated with the same deadly pathogens. Beyond the crowded streets of Tudor cities lay the English countryside, where the vast majority of the population lived and worked. Rural hygiene practices differed significantly from urban customs, shaped by agricultural rhythms, seasonal availability of resources, and the intimate relationship between humans and livestock that defined medieval farming life. In the countryside, the concept of cleanliness remained deeply tied to practical necessity rather than social convention. Farm families rose before dawn to tend animals, milk cows, and collect eggs, their hands inevitably soiled by the honest work of agricultural life. The morning ritual of washing often consisted of little more than splashing cold water from a wooden bucket onto face and hands, using whatever soap could be afforded or made at home. Rural soap making represented one of the few areas where country folk held advantage over their urban counterparts. Farm families had ready access to animal fats from butchering, wood ash from cooking fires, and the time-honored knowledge passed down through generations of mothers and daughters. The process began with collecting ash from hardwood fires, particularly oak and beech, which produced the strongest lye when mixed with water and left to steep for days. The resulting soap bore little resemblance to modern cleansing products. Harsh and caustic, it could strip skin raw if used too liberally, yet it served its purpose for washing clothes, cleaning cooking vessels, and the occasional full-body scrub. Many rural families made soap only once or twice yearly, timing the production to coincide with autumn butchering, when fresh animal fat became available in abundance. Water sources in rural areas presented their own unique challenges and opportunities. While cities struggled with contaminated wells and polluted rivers, country dwellers often enjoyed access to cleaner springs, streams, and private wells. However, the seasonal nature of many water sources meant that availability fluctuated dramatically throughout the year, with some wells running dry during summer droughts and others becoming muddy torrents during spring floods. The shared nature of rural water sources created interesting social dynamics around cleanliness. Village wells served as gathering places where women would meet to draw water for household use, creating informal networks for sharing information about hygiene practices, remedies for common ailments, and gossip about neighbors' cleanliness habits. These conversations often reinforced community standards about acceptable levels of personal hygiene. Bathing in rural areas followed seasonal patterns that urban dwellers rarely experienced. Summer months offered opportunities for washing in streams and ponds, though modesty concerns meant that such activities were carefully timed and located to avoid public scrutiny. Women might bathe early in the morning or late in the evening, while men often combined washing with other water-related activities like watering livestock or cleaning farm equipment. Winter bathing presented significant challenges for rural families. With outdoor water sources frozen and indoor heating limited to single rooms, full-body washing became a rare luxury reserved for special occasions. Many families relied on heated water in wooden tubs placed near the kitchen fire, with family members taking turns in order of social hierarchy. Father first, then mother, followed by children in descending age order. The integration of livestock into daily rural life created unique hygiene challenges that urban dwellers rarely faced. Farmers worked in close proximity to cattle, pigs, chickens, and horses, inevitably acquiring the distinctive odors associated with animal husbandry. The smell of manure, hay, and animal sweat became so commonplace that many rural dwellers ceased to notice it, though visitors from towns often remarked on the powerful agricultural aromas that permeated farming communities. Clothing care in rural areas reflected the practical demands of agricultural work. Garments needed to withstand daily contact with dirt, animal waste, plant matter, and weather extremes while remaining functional for extended periods. Rural families typically owned fewer clothes than their urban counterparts, but invested in more durable fabrics and construction techniques that could survive the rigors of farm life. Washing clothes in rural areas often became a community activity, particularly for larger items like bedding and heavy outer garments. Groups of women would gather at streams or ponds, bringing wooden paddles, homemade soap, and strong arms to beat dirt from fabric fibers. These washing days served important social functions, allowing isolated farm wives to maintain connections with neighbors while accomplishing necessary household tasks. The seasonal nature of rural work created distinct patterns of cleanliness and contamination throughout the agricultural year. Spring planting meant hands and clothes stained with soil and seed, while summer harvests brought exposure to grain dust, pollen, and the sweat of intensive labor under hot sun. Autumn butchering created temporary increases in hygiene attention, as families processed large quantities of meat that required clean handling to prevent spoilage. Rural dental care relied heavily on natural remedies and traditional practices passed down through generations of country folk. Chewing on fibrous plant materials like birch twigs helped clean teeth, while various herbs provided breath freshening and pain relief for dental problems. The rural diet, while often nutritionally superior to urban fare, still lacked many elements necessary for optimal dental health. Personal grooming in rural areas reflected the practical demands of agricultural life, while maintaining basic standards of social acceptability. Hair care involved less frequent washing, but more attention to protection from sun, wind, and agricultural debris. not only for modesty, but also to keep hair clean during dusty farm work, while men might trim beards and hair seasonally rather than maintaining urban standards of regular grooming. The rhythm of rural hygiene followed natural cycles that connected human cleanliness to the broader patterns of agricultural life. Spring cleaning extended beyond houses to include personal hygiene routines. Summer offered opportunities for more frequent washing. Autumn required preparation for winter's hygiene challenges, and winter demanded careful conservation of resources while maintaining basic cleanliness standards. This cyclical approach to hygiene created a sustainable system that worked within the constraints of rural Tudor life, even as it differed dramatically from emerging urban standards of cleanliness and social presentation. Now, let's address some of the most persistent myths about Tudor hygiene that have somehow survived into modern times. These misconceptions paint an even grimmer picture than reality, which is quite an achievement considering how challenging cleanliness actually was during this period. Perhaps the most enduring myth is that Tudor people never bathed at all. This simply isn't true, though the reality is more nuanced than either extreme would suggest. While daily bathing wasn't common, people did wash themselves regularly, just not in the way we might expect today. The confusion often stems from conflating different types of washing. Full-body immersion baths were indeed rare and often viewed with suspicion by medical authorities. However, this doesn't mean people walked around covered in dirt and grime for months on end. Daily washing of hands, face, and other exposed areas was standard practice among all social classes. Another persistent myth suggests that Tudor people believed water was inherently dangerous and avoided it entirely. While it's true that medical theory of the time warned against certain types of bathing, particularly hot baths that might open the pores to disease, water itself wasn't feared. The concern was more about how and when water was used, not water in general. The reality is that Tudor medical understanding, while different from ours, wasn't entirely irrational given their context. They observed that people sometimes became ill after bathing, particularly in public bathhouses, and drew logical conclusions based on their understanding of disease transmission. They didn't know about bacteria, but they could see patterns of illness. This leads us to another misconception about medieval and Tudor attitudes toward cleanliness. Many assume that people of this era were simply ignorant about hygiene. But this oversimplifies their situation dramatically. They understood the connection between cleanliness and health. They just had different methods and faced different challenges than we do today. For instance, the practice of changing undergarments frequently was considered essential for cleanliness. Clean linen was thought to absorb impurities from the body, making it a crucial part of personal hygiene. This wasn't ignorance. It was a practical solution given their understanding and available resources. The myth that Tudor people covered bad smells with perfume rather than washing also needs examination. While perfumes and pomanders were certainly used, they weren't typically employed as substitutes for washing. Instead, they served multiple purposes, including protection against disease, which was thought to spread through bad air or miasma. Perfumes and scented items were expensive luxury goods, not practical solutions for everyday cleanliness. The average person couldn't afford to mask body odor with costly fragrances, so they relied on more practical methods like frequent changes of linen and regular washing of exposed skin. Another area where myths abound is dental hygiene. While it's true that Tudor dental care was rudimentary by modern standards, people weren't completely ignorant about oral health. Tooth cleaning was practiced, though methods varied considerably from what we use today. Wealthy individuals might use cloths or primitive toothbrushes made from twigs to clean their teeth. Various powders and pastes were employed, some more effective than others. The wealthy sometimes used crushed pearls or coral as abrasives, while others might use salt or herbs. The poor state of many Tudor teeth had more to do with diet and available treatments than complete neglect. Sugar was becoming more available during this period, particularly among the wealthy, and its effects on dental health weren't yet narrated. Hair care is another area surrounded by misconceptions. The idea that Tudor people never washed their hair is simply false. Hair washing did occur, though not as frequently as modern practice might suggest. The challenge was that soap suitable for hair was expensive and not always available. Instead, people often used alternative methods for hair care. Brushing was common and considered important for distributing natural oils and removing dirt. Various rinses made from herbs or other natural ingredients were used to clean and condition hair. These methods weren't necessarily inferior, just different. The elaborate hairstyles of the wealthy weren't necessarily signs of poor hygiene either. These styles often incorporated clean hair and were maintained by servants who understood hair care. The complexity of these styles actually required relatively clean hair to achieve properly. Clothing hygiene presents another area where modern assumptions often miss the mark. The idea that Tudor people wore the same clothes for months without cleaning them is largely exaggerated. While outer garments might not be washed frequently, undergarments were changed regularly when possible. The challenge with clothing wasn't ignorance about cleanliness, but practical limitations. Washing clothes was labor-intensive and could damage expensive fabrics. Additionally, people typically owned fewer garments than we do today, making frequent washing more problematic. Wealthy individuals had servants dedicated to clothing care, including washing, mending, and proper storage. The poor faced greater challenges but still understood the importance of clean clothing, even if they couldn't always achieve it as often as desired. Public health measures also contradict the idea that Tudor society was completely ignorant about hygiene. Cities had regulations about waste disposal, street cleaning, and water quality. These weren't always perfectly enforced, but they demonstrate awareness of the connection between cleanliness and public health. London, for example, had designated areas for waste disposal and regulations about keeping streets clean. Violators could face fines or other penalties. These measures weren't always effective, but they show systematic thinking about urban hygiene challenges. The role of guilds in maintaining standards also contradicts myths about Tudor indifference to cleanliness. Various trades had specific requirements for cleanliness and quality control. Bakers, brewers, and other food-related trades faced particular scrutiny regarding sanitary practices. Even medical practice, while primitive by modern standards, included concepts of cleanliness. Physicians understood that clean wounds healed better than dirty ones, and surgical instruments were often cleaned between uses. This wasn't systematic sterilization, but it wasn't complete ignorance either. Perhaps the most important misconception to address is the idea that Tudor people were fundamentally different from us in their desires for comfort and cleanliness. They wanted to be clean, comfortable, and healthy just as much as we do today. The differences lay in their methods, resources, and understanding, not in their basic human desires. Understanding these misconceptions helps us appreciate both how far we've come and how much Tudor people accomplished given their limitations. They weren't ignorant or indifferent to hygiene. They were working within the constraints of their time and knowledge to achieve cleanliness and health as best they could. As we continue exploring Tudor hygiene practices, keep these corrections in mind. The reality of Tudor cleanliness was complex, challenging, and often ingenious, even if it seems strange or insufficient by today's standards. As we draw our gentle exploration of Tudor hygiene to a close, let us take a moment to reflect on the remarkable journey we've shared through the aromatic landscape of 16th century England. We've wandered together through cobblestone streets, where chamber pots emptied from upper windows, visited grand palaces, where even royalty bathed sparingly, and explored humble cottages, where families made do with whatever cleansing methods they could manage. The Tudor period, spanning from 1485 to 1603, represents a fascinating bridge between medieval traditions and emerging Renaissance ideals. In matters of personal hygiene, this era reveals humanity's complex relationship with cleanliness, health, and social status. What we've discovered tonight is that hygiene practices weren't simply matters of personal preference, but intricate reflections of medical understanding, religious beliefs, economic circumstances, and social hierarchies. Think of how different their world was from ours, where we turn a handle and receive clean, hot water instantly. Tudor families might walk considerable distances to fetch water from wells or streams, where we have antibacterial soaps and sanitizers. They relied on herbs, vinegar, and sometimes nothing more than cold water and rough cloth. Yet, within these constraints, they developed ingenious solutions and maintained their own standards of cleanliness and respectability. The wealthy Tudor nobles, despite their infrequent bathing habits, understood the importance of appearing clean and fresh. They changed their linen undergarments regularly, believing this practice absorbed bodily impurities. They used perfumes, pomanders, and scented waters to mask odors. They employed servants to maintain their clothing and living spaces. Their approach to hygiene was different from ours, but it was systematic and purposeful within their understanding of health and cleanliness. Common folk, too, had their methods and traditions. They might not have had access to fine soaps or elaborate bathing chambers, but they understood the value of clean clothes, tidy homes, and basic personal maintenance. Market towns buzzed with the activity of washerwomen, barber surgeons, and merchants selling various cleaning supplies. Even in the humblest circumstances, people found ways to maintain dignity and cleanliness according to their means and understanding. The medical theories that guided Tudor hygiene practices seem quaint to us now, but they represented serious attempts to understand health and wellness. The belief in miasma or bad air led to practices we might find counterproductive, but also encouraged attention to environmental cleanliness. The theory of humoral balance influenced everything from bathing frequency to food choices, creating a holistic approach to health that connected physical cleanliness with overall well-being. Religious influences shaped hygiene practices in profound ways. The Protestant Reformation brought new attitudes toward the body and cleanliness, while Catholic traditions maintained their own approaches to physical and spiritual purity. Monasteries and convents often led by example in matters of cleanliness and order, their practices influencing surrounding communities. The intersection of faith and hygiene created complex social expectations that varied by region and religious affiliation. Perhaps most remarkably, we've seen how Tudor people adapted to their circumstances with creativity and resourcefulness. Unable to bathe frequently, they developed elaborate systems of clean linen. Lacking modern dental care, they created tooth powders and cleaning methods using available materials. Without refrigeration, they developed preservation and preparation techniques that maintained food safety. Their solutions weren't always effective by our standards, but they demonstrate human ingenuity in the face of challenging circumstances. The social aspects of Tudor hygiene reveal fascinating insights into human nature and community life. Public bathhouses served as social centers until moral concerns led to their decline. Barber shops functioned as gathering places for men to discuss news while receiving grooming services. Laundry Day brought women together for shared work and conversation. Even in matters as mundane as personal cleanliness, community connections flourished. As you drift toward sleep tonight, imagine yourself settling into a Tudor bed, perhaps stuffed with sweet-smelling herbs to ward off insects and unpleasant odors. The day's work is done. The fire burns low in the hearth, and the house grows quiet. Outside, the night air carries the mingled scents of wood smoke, cooking food, and yes, the less pleasant aromas of daily life in an age before modern sanitation. Yet there's something comforting about this simpler time, when life moved at a gentler pace and people found contentment within their circumstances. The Tudor approach to hygiene reminds us that cleanliness standards are culturally constructed and historically contingent. What seems obviously necessary to us might have seemed excessive or even dangerous to them. What they considered perfectly acceptable might strike us as inadequate. This perspective encourages humility about our own practices and curiosity about different ways of living and being in the world. So rest well tonight, grateful for the conveniences of modern hygiene, while appreciating the resilience and adaptability of our Tudor ancestors. Their world may have been aromatic in ways we'd find challenging, but it was also rich with human ingenuity, community connection, and the eternal human drive to live with dignity and purpose, regardless of circumstances. Sweet dreams, and may your sleep be as peaceful as a Tudor lord's, freshly powdered and perfumed for the night ahead.